Thanks for having me. I'm going to spend some time talking a little bit about the state of the American middle class and the American dream, and we have our sort of couple of slides up here that will give us some indication of where we're at. So in the top one, Premier Hu from China shows up with his load of U.S. Treasury bonds, and the people inside the White House say, "Straighten up, the landlord's here." In our bottom one, Uncle Sam next to his Hummer says, "Give up your nukes or be destroyed, and please turn on pump 4." We'll actually talk about things more serious here in a second. So I'm going to try to make this fairly brief and fairly accessible. So we're going to talk about just how bad it is out there. And the answer is, unfortunately, at least in the middle of a recession, pretty bad. We'll talk about the state of the American middle class, which is now, I think, on life support, according to a lot of analysts. And we might get to talking about the middle class and globalization. We might not. We'll see how things go. A lot of this stuff comes from, as Colin said, my book, Post-Industrial Peasants, The Illusion of Middle Class Prosperity, 2007 book. I've got some updated analyses to add to that. So, how bad is it exactly? Well, just looking at 2008 alone, world markets lost about $50 trillion, which is about $8,300 for every man, woman, and child alive. So, in terms of, the actual global depletion of income and wealth, that's actually quite serious. The United States itself lost about 3.5 million jobs in 2008-09, and there's sort of been a turnaround since then, but as our speaker said last year, Mr. Ettinger, hasn't made a complete turnaround. Current projected budget deficit's about $1.4 trillion. There are a lot of efforts being made now to try to make that smaller, of various styles and qualities. We have a $770 billion bailout package for banks, adds up to about $87 million an hour for a year, so a lot of money. It appears we'll get most of it back. And we gave about a $15 million bailout package for the big three automakers, 2 of which are now profitable and are starting to pay their loans back. So, new job creation, as Mr. Ettinger pointed out last week, is definitely not in a good place, even at this stage of an economic recovery. At our current job creation rate, it will take nine more years to get back to the levels of employment we had in 2007. Median housing prices have dropped 20% since 2005, and at current rates of change, it'll take them 13 years to recover to 2006 levels. That's a massive decline in the wealth of the average middle-class homeowner in the United States. Commercial vacancies are running near 20% in many cities, and in some cities are higher than that. Now, there are several cities where you can actually get 1 year's worth of free rent if you'll sign a 2-year lease. So things are desperate there. And consumer demand is about all I can say, darn flat. There's some indication consumer demand has returned the last couple of months, but consumer demand has really been pretty flat for most of the last 3 years. Here's the graph Mr. Ettinger had up last week that shows what types of recoveries would be necessary to produce job growth to keep up with the growth in population in the United States. Scenario where line number 3 is where we would be if job creation remains at roughly what it is now, and it would take a quite robust recovery to get us back to where we were in 2008. So we've dug ourselves a very deep job hole here. We have a record trade deficit with the Chinese, about $800 billion to date. In 2008-2009, retailers had the 2 worst Decembers ever recorded. The University of Michigan has been plotting consumer confidence numbers for quite a long time, and 2008-2009 Decembers were the worst ever on record. There are record numbers of bankruptcies, mortgage foreclosures, and defaults. The record numbers of bankruptcies is kind of interesting because in 2005 we passed bankruptcy reform legislation that was supposed to make it harder to file for bankruptcy, but people are in fact so far in hock and have incomes that are so low that virtually no one qualifies for the diversion that's in the bankruptcy reform bill. So what the bankruptcy reform bill has done is made it more expensive to file for bankruptcy. So there are literally, in the 2007 Consumer Bankruptcy Project data, people who can't financially afford to file for bankruptcy to claim that they have no money. An interesting idea. But what concretely has happened to the U.S. middle class? Well, let's talk about, first of all, who are talking about it. And in the book and elsewhere, when I talk about the middle class, I'm basically talking about people who are hanging around the median of the U.S. income distribution, which is currently about $49,006, whose main income source is earnings from a job. So most of these people don't have interest or rent income, or have very negligible amounts of interest and rent income, and their major source of wealth is an owner-occupied home. And the owner-occupied home has been a major means of acquiring wealth in the United States for most of the post-war era, and it's the main source of wealth that most members of the middle class have. My basic argument, which, while the data has changed, the basic argument really hasn't changed a whole lot, is that U.S. middle class has actually experienced a rather unprecedented decline in real purchasing power, and that the difference between what people can afford based on what their incomes and earnings allow and what the economy is needed in terms of consuming has been filled by easily available credit. The credit magically appeared at about the time middle class incomes were stagnating most seriously. So sometime just when that income started to go flat, all of a sudden you could buy a car with no money down. College students start getting credit cards in the mail, and they didn't have to fill out an application for them. You didn't have to prove that you actually made any money to get a credit card in the first place. And it had a very high limit, and if you spent close to the limit, rather than doing what they did in the 70s to me when I got my first credit card, which was yank it from you, they simply increased your limit so you could keep going. And a whole series of examples like that. And what we argue in the book is essentially that the use of debt as an instrument for supporting consumption looks an awful lot like serfdom in an agrarian economy. And that the middle class is literally a set of post-industrial peasants. They're owned by someone else because consumption has been fueled by credit with little or no income to back it up. Some other components of the argument, very real productivity gains in the 80s and 90s were taken by others and were not given to the primary people that produced them. The deregulation of consumer credit markets produced what amounted to essentially a socialization of credit risk through the sales of asset-backed securities. So the people who essentially loaned money didn't hold the risk of the loans that they had. They sold most of those off. This is a system that's now in fairly serious crisis, but will probably come back in some form, I would say. And politically, the consequences of this have been pretty corrosive as well. So, as we argue in the book, there are real declines in reciprocity, community, and civility. Don't give them anything. We could do better than this, but we have to want to first. And what is this thing doing here? I'll hold it and see if this makes things better. So the evidence we have comes primarily in graphs. So this is sort of median pre-tax family income in 2007 dollars. Has moved some, but not a whole lot. Between 1971 and 2007, has risen about $8,000. So not bad, but not wonderful. But it's in the ratio between what the captains of industry make and what the average person on the street makes that things have gotten stratospheric. And the latest figure on this is from 2009. The number is now 430 to 1. So the average pay that CEOs get relative to the average production worker is now around 430 to 1. By the way, our ratios of what managers make to what average workers make and the number of managers we hire relative to the number of production workers we hire are the highest in the world. So, in terms of bureaucratic burden of management, this is true, by the way, in all things we do. Our nonprofit organizations have more managers. Our universities have more deans and presidents and vice presidents and all that. Our corporations have more managers than anyone else's in the world. And we pay them more money. U.S. savings is, of course, nowhere, which probably doesn't surprise any of you too much. U.S. savings rate has started to go up a little bit, which is a promising sign. What would have happened if we actually paid people according to some index of productivity? Well, the average hourly wage from 1988 to 2006. Oh, okay. I'll try that. The average productivity enhanced wage here would be around $16.51 instead of what it actually is, which is $11.75. So, almost regardless of how there have been productivity gains, but productivity gains haven't trickled down to the average person's wallet. There's obviously been more credit card use and more use of credit of all kinds. And average credit card debt per household is still quite high. Average credit card debt now has gone down a little bit, but it's only gone down because credit card issuers have written off about 10% nationally of what is owed. So credit card debt is going down because debts are being forgiven, not because people are paying them off. And there have also been changes in the way the tax system works. And as Mr. Ettinger talked about last week a little bit, if you look at the change in the composition of where the federal government gets its tax dollars, almost all, a large percentage of federal receipts now come in the form of payroll taxes for Social Security and individual income taxes as opposed to corporate income taxes, excise taxes, or other taxes. The middle class has had a larger and larger bite of their incomes taken by taxes. There have been tax cuts, it just hasn't been for them. And there really literally has been no tax relief, but there's also been serious inflation on big ticket items that members of the middle class have historically relied on. Take, for example, homes in good neighborhoods. As Liz Warren and Elizabeth Taggy have pointed out, what families have done over the years since, really the late 1970s or so, is they've entered into the competition for a home in a good neighborhood, generally defined as a neighborhood in a good school system, with two incomes. And they use two incomes to win the competition for the good home in the good neighborhood with the good schools. Because there are a shortage of good homes in good neighborhoods with good schools, the prices on those homes are bid up. And the people with two incomes rather than one have an advantage in this competition. That is until one of the two people loses their job. At which point, as their book points out, the two-income track, people will do just about anything to keep the house because the house is in the neighborhood with the good school system, including putting their mortgage payments on credit card, cashing out their savings to make their mortgage payments, and a variety of other things that financial analysts would tell people not to do, not because they necessarily want to stay there, but because they want to stay there for the sake of the kids, which is why they bought the house in the first place using two incomes rather than one. So, homes in good neighborhoods have gotten expensive. Inflation on those has been somewhere in the neighborhood of 200% in the last 20 years. State-supported college educations. Don't we know it? State dollars have been replaced by tuition, pretty much. Donors and gifts and grant income somewhat, but mainly tuition. So colleges and state-supported colleges and universities are no longer state-supported. Nor are they state-assisted. They're colleges within states. And that's happening in other parts of the country too, in addition to here. Health insurance. a lot of employers still provide health insurance, and a lot of employers, to their credit, still pay some percentage of what the health insurance is. The problem is the premiums have been going up and the percentage is getting smaller. So average family contributions have risen from about $60 in the middle of the 1980s to now about $230 a month, and continue to go up. Affordable daycare? No way. In many places, it's non-existent. The national average outlay, by the way, is $100 per child, $100 a week per child. I'm not sure you could get daycare in this town for less than double that, but not in my experience anyway. The defined pension is dying out and being replaced by 401k plans and other contribution-based plans. And many of these plans, at least until the recession started, you had to invest in your own company's stock and only your own company's stock. You had a completely undiversified retirement portfolio. So this is what happened to the Enron workers that didn't cash out at the right time. So there have been serious squeeze put on the traditional accoutrements of middle-class life. A decent job with a decent wage that lasts a decent amount of time, an owner-occupied home, college educations for the children, all are now in some state of peril and have been for a while, actually, even before the recession. Some people ask, what has globalization got to do with any of this? And the answer is, well, a little bit, not a whole lot. Blaming globalization is sort of like blaming God. Like, that's nice. There are actual people that do things. And social scientists tend to like to talk about actual people that do things rather than amorphous forces. So, in some notorious cases, these changes have been aided by changes our federal government has made. So there are, for example, House and Senate representative bills that have passed in the last 20 years that provide a tax incentive to pharmaceutical companies to move pharmaceutical production to the Caribbean rather than the upper Midwest. Multinational corporations use various transfer pricing schemes to arrange their profits and their losses so that they never make any money in the United States, so they never pay any taxes. And they keep their profits elsewhere, and they don't pay taxes on them unless they repatriate them, and they basically just don't repatriate them. The real question, though, is what are the incentives actors see, and why do they act on them? But I think the biggest thing most of the changes of the last 20 years have exposed is a rather interesting problem. U.S. middle-class purchasing power is a public good nobody really has an incentive to contribute toward. So, sort of like other public goods problem. We all like streets, we all like highways, we all like police and fire protection, we like the ambulance to come if we're sick, but if we had our own brothers, we would not pay for those things. We would try to get other people to pay for those things so we would have the benefits of them and we would free ride. The same has sort of become true with regard to creating a decent job in the United States. We'd rather free ride. Have someone else create them, so someone else will have the purchasing power to buy goods we will make. And when nobody does that, something else has to be done to stimulate consumption. So, last couple of points I'll make here. In our current system, investors have a great deal of autonomy, and have been granted a great deal of autonomy for quite a long time now. And some of us have personally benefited from this, so I'm not going to say this hasn't put money in my pocket. It's certainly put money in my pocket. We've moved investments overseas to lower costs. We favored investments through the tax system. So investment in other types of income and earnings income are not treated the same by the tax system. We've sold investors treasury bills at favorable rates to make up for the tax dollars we don't collect, which could be construed as a tax with a rebate attached. Wouldn't you like a tax with a rebate attached? Here, I'll pay you my federal taxes on April 15th, and then 20 years from now, you'll pay me back that plus interest as a bond. Perfect. I'll take it. we've allowed investors to import goods made overseas to sell to American consumers. And in part because of the strong dollar created by all of these changes and trade deficits, we've increased revenues investors receive that are payable in dollars. But then we also have a larger point that James Galbraith makes that we don't make, but it's actually kind of an interesting thing to think about. The middle class now supports three welfare states: a merely funded welfare state for the poor, a privately funded welfare state for them, and an interest rent payment welfare state for the world's wealthy. And I would actually add to that a prison industrial complex, which Bruce Western and his colleagues show is more expensive than a Western European welfare state in terms of the amount of money it costs. More importantly, we've loaned American consumers money instead of paying them. And while we've done this, we've allowed various political elites of various stripes to engage in the politics of displacement. Let's fight about anything but money. Some examples. Here we have Senator Wingnut. Constituents come to talk to him. Schools, gas prices, health costs, jobs, taxes. Senator Wingnut says, my constituents are united in demanding a constitutional amendment outlawing flag burning. Or our second example of the politics of displacement. The cops come to a domestic dispute. Okay, Mrs. Hickerloper says the legalization of same-sex marriage is destroying her blissful 47 union with Mr. Hickerloper. Or this interaction that actually happened in a telephone call. Pollster, do you know Obama is an American citizen? Respondent, will it lower my mortgage payment? Financial distress, as you might guess, just by, reading the newspapers, which have done a pretty good job covering this stuff, actually, is not evenly distributed throughout the country. There are pockets of the American economy in different states in the United States and different local regions that are really having a hard time of it. But what's interesting, if you do a little bit of research on this, is that dubious mortgage lending practices and mortgage debts are very highly correlated with low social capital, so places where people don't belong to public organizations, watch a lot of television, don't get out in public, don't vote, don't go to political rallies, all of that. Where there's poor aggregate funding of education, at least on a national comparative basis, and where there's poor aggregate performance on measures of education and public educational performance, standardized tests, grade point averages, all of that. What's sort of interesting, the places where the mortgage fraud is also the places where there isn't a community that can actually combat them. And even a lightly regulated financial market would have changed things and would change things, I think, fairly considerably. So if you look at data from the 2007 Consumer Bankruptcy Project, which is basically a project where people are interviewed before they go into bankruptcy court. And the data collection as part of the American Bankruptcy Project gets not only the documents you filed when you declare bankruptcy, but ask you a series of questions about how you end up in bankruptcy court. If we simply impose some 1970s-style credit limits, which used to be called in the banking business fiduciary responsibility, right? You loan money to people who can pay it back. Interesting concept. The average 2007 Consumer Bankruptcy Project respondent in a 1970s world would have $19,000 less credit card debt, a mortgage payment that was $235 a month smaller, a car payment that was $49 a month smaller, monthly available income that was $667 larger, and a yearly income that's $8,000 larger. So, big differences. So, what's to be done about this? Well, there are a variety of proposals out there. A lot of them have wide support, some less so. But I think some basic parameters would help here probably greatly. One thing I think we might want to think about agreeing on is the concept that family values cost money. and that good jobs with good wages are family value. Name the social problem you don't like. High crime, high divorce, high abortion among teenagers, drug use and juvenile delinquency among kids. Any sort of health measure you care to name. Almost all of them are better among people who have decent jobs, and are worse among people who don't have decent jobs. So, good jobs at good wages fix a lot of the social ills that we pay attention to a lot. Or, how about Warren Buffett's basic idea? If you're going to make a killing in the capital market, you should have to take other people with you. Hire somebody. Pay them a decent wage. What a concept.
At the outset, Noga O'Connor, who works at the Policy Project as a senior research associate, came down with the flu, is unable to join us. I also do some work with the Policy Project, and so I'm going to sort of take over her presentation. We're just drawn from a couple of ongoing reports that we do. One known as the State of Working Iowa, which looks at sort of job quality and working conditions in Iowa, and another one, which I'm not directly involved in, that Noga was going to present on, which is the cost of living report. And as Kevin did, I'm going to sort of draw on some of the sort of familiar dismal sort of graphical representations that we've relied on to drive home the point, both the sort of historical pattern that we're working through, but also as this graphic, which is adapted from Joel's presentation, suggests the importance of public policy. So this graph shows the share that the top 10% of income earners claim. And so what we see, that's down this side here. And what we see here with the launch of the New Deal is the dramatic change that public policy makes with the institution of Social Security, collective bargaining rights, mortgage insurance. These basic sort of safety net support system creates the middle class, drives down that inequality that had persisted in the 1920s and 1930s, and gives us this era of shared responsibility, of shared prosperity through the post-war era that lasts from the end of the war into the 1970s. And then, as we've discussed the last couple of weeks, just as dramatically, you get an attack on the New Deal beginning in the 1970s, a withdrawal or shredding of that safety net, and inequality goes right back up, now higher than it was in the 1920s. Interestingly, and this is also drawn from Joel's presentation, this is the era in which, as Joel said, we're growing together, and so those are the income shares, and of course, this is the era in which we're growing apart, and so most of the gains are going to the very top income share. Now, what's interesting, particularly, if we think about what's going on in Wisconsin, is the way in which the map of union membership and union density is the exact reverse of that. Because in many respects, the union movement has, across the 20th century, across the modern era, been the cradle of the middle class. And so here you have the passage of the Wagner Act in 1935, a spike in union membership, jumping first with the organizing of the 1930s, and then jumping again during World War II, then beginning to drop off with the passage of the Taft-Hartley and State Right to Work Acts in the 1940s, then dropping off a little bit further with deindustrialization, some concessionary bargaining. And then from the late 1970s, the graph shows the difference between public sector and private sector rates of unionization. And it's this gap, I think, which generates a lot of the resentment which is playing out in settings like Wisconsin and Ohio, and soon to be Iowa, with regard to the sort of benefits enjoyed by public sector workers. Nothing special about them except that ordinary workers used to have them and don't anymore. And then, of course, we have to filter these long-term changes through what's going on in the Iowa economy. And this picks up on some of what Peter was talking about last week. So we have a very weak recovery from recession. In the previous recession, the one that began in the early 1990s, Iowa's recovery was pretty steady. It took us a long time, almost 4 years, to get back to the level of jobs that we lost in this recession. And the recovery has been very slow since then. As important to this, and I think contributing to this sort of the insecurity of Iowa working families, is the fact that in that process, in the turnover of that business cycle, we've seen a churning in the labor market in which we've lost good jobs and gained bad jobs. You can see here that a lot of the jobs in which there are heavy losses, particularly manufacturing and information, are some of the higher wage jobs, whereas some of the gains, as the jobs come back, are coming at the lower end. This is also true if we look at the sorts of benefits that go with jobs. We've made the point, I think, in different ways in every session, that the United States is unique in the amount of security that it attaches to jobs, and the way in which a good job with good benefits is really the only safety net that one can rely on. So this is a little bit complicated, so I'll walk you through it. So here we have the sectors of the Iowa economy here, and here's the number of jobs in those sectors, in thousands, in January of 2000. At the time, the rate of employer-sponsored health insurance in those sectors was about this. So, to take manufacturing, for example, we have 250,000 jobs, 73% of them have health insurance, so 182,000 covered jobs, right? That's this column. And so, of the total jobs in the private sector, about 55% have health insurance, or we're about here. Now, if we jump ahead to the end of the recession, we see, of course, job losses, job change. We also see a decline in the rate of health insurance coverage. So the number of covered jobs have slipped, both because we're losing jobs and because we're losing coverage. So these last three columns show how you divide the loss of employment-sponsored health insurance. Some of it, again, is just because we've lost the job. 36,000 jobs in manufacturing. Gained a few of those back, but not many. Some of those is because we're losing coverage. So we've lost 5,000 covered jobs in manufacturing just because the rate of employer-sponsored health insurance is falling. So as we churned through that recession, through that business cycle, in the process, we lost about 30,000 good jobs, that is, jobs with health insurance. All of this contributes to, as Kevin emphasized, a sort of dramatic decline in real income, median family incomes. This chart shows for Iowa the change by educational level, which is particularly dramatic for those who don't have a high school education. So in real dollars, those with less than a high school education made $13 and change in 1979. They now make less than $10. 25%, more than 25% loss. In fact, most of the gains are made by those with some college or a bachelor education or higher. Median male wages since 1979 have fallen. And so wages are very weak. This is a long-term problem, but it's one that's been exacerbated by the recession. And as Kevin emphasized, and these are numbers for Iowa, as wages have stagnated, the costs of other things have not. And so even in Iowa, which is where it's relatively cheap cost of living, rather, in a decade, the cost of housing went up 40%. The average tuition went up at the public schools went up over 100%. Health spending over 120%. All the time when the median wage, this little bar you can hardly see at the bottom, barely moved. Now, moving to the evidence from then the cost of living studies that the Iowa Policy Project does, we get this kind of circumstance. What this cost of living research does is it basically takes a sort of more sensible version of the poverty level that is factoring in what working families actually spend money on and seeing where the gaps lie. And so this is for a single parent family with one child, with two children. You can see the various categories, the dollar amounts, monthly totals, the annual total, and the gap. And so this is the hourly wage that you would need in order to meet that demand. That is, in order to meet your basic expenses. And this is the yellow here is the gap between that wage and the actual median wage in Iowa. So a substantial gap for, again, the example here, a single parent family with two children, $5 an hour short of meeting basic expenses. Among families across Iowa with small children, that is at least one child under 5, over 2/3 of single-parent families are under that threshold. About 1/4 of two-parent families with one full-time worker earn less. And even 10% of two-parent families with two income earners fall below that threshold. As this is occurring, of course, it's being driven largely by an increase in the sort of basic items of the household budget, things like childcare, housing, and transportation, but most dramatically, as I pointed out earlier, as Kevin pointed out as well, is the sharp increase in healthcare costs, both driven by sort of generic healthcare inflation, which is more expensive every year, but also by the increased cost, particularly for family coverage, which has skyrocketed. What we can do at the state level is limited. These are, in large respects, national economic problems, and the solutions are national as well. But certainly, one response would be to raise the minimum wage and index it with inflation. If you look at a graph, I should have thrown one in here, of the actual value of the median wage, it sort of goes up when there's an increase and then it falls off. That is, it loses value for inflation and then jumps up again. And it's still now below what it was, in real dollars value, what it was worth in 1979. Iowa, as many other states, are very aggressive about going after new industry with economic development programs. But research has shown that the wage standards that are attached to those programs are virtually non-existent. That is, if you said, you can go after X business as long as they create this number of jobs at this wage, you could leverage up the local wage even in the private sector. And as we saw in that earlier matrix with the sort of dismal payoff for a high school or less education, investing in education is, in the long run, and Peter Fisher made this point as well, your best economic development policy of all. There are also, at our fingertips in Iowa, under a sort of common lever of state policy, various work support programs. And I emphasize these because I think there's generally a consensus, sort of left, right, across the political spectrum, that work should pay, that hardworking Americans should be able to support their families. There's less of a consensus that people who are not working get benefits from the state. But if we can start with this as a point of agreement, then one sort of important policy lever is to provide support for low wage or lower wage labor. And those include the obvious things on the list here: child care assistance, food assistance, the earned income tax credit, which is a refundable tax credit that is attached to low income work, it basically supplements the wages of very low income earners. It's a tax credit rather than tax deduction, so it actually increases your effective income. Public health insurance programs make a big difference, again, taking the pressure off the job to provide all those benefits, and scattered other programs like, for example, energy assistance. This is a sort of sketch in Iowa example here from actually Cedar Rapids, Iowa, of how those things work and how they often work in unexpected ways. So we have along the bottom here an hourly wage, $8, $10, $12, so on. You can read it as well as I can. And up the side here are the basic resources available. So at $9 an hour, you qualify for a number of these programs, giving you an effective income that is, sort of above the break-even line. One of the problems with these programs is they tend to have income cliffs. All of a sudden, you don't qualify. And there are real problems here when, for example, you reach just under $12 an hour, you lose your child care subsidy, all of a sudden you can't make ends meet. You dive below that line. You have to climb back up again with your earnings. There's another dip when you lose your EITC, a dip when you lose eligibility for public health insurance, and the like. So another, sensible state reform is to phase in those programs or to phase those benefits in and out rather than have sharp cutoffs, to have a sort of smoother line so that people aren't subject not only to those drops below the threshold, but to the disincentive that people face when they're going to go from $11.99 an hour to $12 an hour, for example. And so here, example, you're sort of flattening out that line. So if you just change the food stamp and child care programs, for example, you get a line that looked more like this. They'll get a drop off here, but you'd stay above that red line. Okay, that's all I have. That's my sort of sketch of sort of dragging Kevin's data into the Iowa setting and talking about some of the policy levers available at the state level. So what we want to do next then is move to the local level. And Brian Loring of the Neighborhood Centers of Johnson County is going to talk about what this looks like as it plays out in local communities. Because local governments are really ultimately the vendors of most of these programs.
Good evening. I want to thank Professor Gordon for inviting me. I was at Lucinda Williams last Friday night and saw him sitting in front of me and remembered I had to do this thing. So I sort of threw this together in a hurry, but I hope it is useful to you all. Again, my name is Brian Loring. I'm with the Neighborhood Centers of Johnson County. We are a private nonprofit here in Iowa City. I'm going to talk a little bit about how, kind of looking at this through the perspective of welfare reform, and maybe even more specifically looking at how the child care subsidy in that reform has had an impact on families' lives here locally, and looking at sort of how economic trends locally have had an impact on those families as well. Before I do, I want to just give you a brief overview of what we are at the Neighborhood Centers. We are in a lot of ways, we replicate kind of the old settlement house model. We have centers that are located in low-income neighborhoods here in Iowa City, and we do a lot of different programming that really is designed to address the needs of the neighborhoods that we work in. And so that includes, early childhood programming, programs for kids in after-school programs, summer camps, that kind of thing, adult, parent, family sorts of things. We have Head Start, Even Start. We are recipients of some of the famous or infamous state preschool programming. We do a lot of community development sorts of things. We look at issues that impact the neighborhood as a whole, not just the individuals in the neighborhood, but looking at what is it that has an effect on families' lives in the neighborhood. For instance, looking at building some of the social capital that Kevin talked about earlier, and how that is really important in terms of how well families are able to deal with some of the issues that they're working with. I want to start with just a brief overview of what was AFDC, Aid to Families with Dependent Children. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this, but it's just sort of some background in what I want to talk about tonight. AFDC was around for a long time and really was an important safety net for families. It was something that was designed in a way that allowed families to stay home with their children as a value. It sort of valued the parent as a teacher, first teacher for their child, and valued children staying home with the parent. But as you know, as we've learned tonight, as we got into the early 90s, some of the support for welfare began to erode, and we saw a lot of state initiatives in the early 90s looking at welfare and saying, listen, we've got to change welfare. It's sort of some of the same, I think, motivations that we see with respect to, what's happening with public service workers in Wisconsin and Iowa. There were a lot of folks who were taking the perspective that welfare recipients were undeserving and that we needed to reform welfare. And in Iowa in the early 90s, we did take a step in 93 and 94 to change welfare in Iowa. We asked for a waiver from the federal government and created a program that was a little different than the traditional AFDC, and it was known as the Family Investment Plan. And the state of Iowa asked for a waiver to implement some of the reforms. We barely had that done when the federal government stepped in. There were a lot of states that took on welfare reform in the early and mid 90s, but by 1996, the federal government had said we're going to step in and change welfare as we know it. And you look at this quote from President Clinton at the time. They're going to protect the guarantees of health care, nutrition, child care, all of which are critical to helping families move from welfare to work. So I want to look at how families, we have kind of a perspective of how we move from kind of the underclass or the poverty class into the middle class. And during the mid and late 90s, there was certainly a lot of attention given to this and resources that were devoted to it. Essentially, the Welfare Reform Initiative was what ended kind of the entitlement nature of welfare. It required recipients to begin working, had a lifetime limit on benefits for folks. Also, was encouraging of two-parent families and enforcement of child support. In the 90s as well, I mean, if those of you that are old enough, and I look in the audience, and not all of you are that old, but in the late 90s, there was quite an economic boom, both in Iowa and nationally. At the same time, we were implementing welfare reform, which kind of tempered or buffered some of the impact of this in Iowa, particularly. Also, as on the cusp of welfare reform, there were a lot of supports in place. I mean, the government did make some effort to ensure that, at least initially, that welfare reform was received well and went smoothly. Locally, there were a lot of things happening in the late 90s as well, including the fact that we had really such a hot economy locally that in fact, the chamber and one of the economic development groups here in Iowa City spent really most of their time recruiting workers to move into Iowa City. I recall back in probably 97 or 98 meeting at a chamber event here locally, and there was a gentleman who was opening the Geico insurance operation over in Coralville. We had a conversation about how things were going, just sort of pleasantries. And he said they were short several dozen workers. They were short. They couldn't find people to fill the positions. And so at that time, everybody was all about getting folks to move here. And there were a lot. Johnson County and Cedar Rapids, Lynn County, were putting out advertisements encouraging people to move into the area to fill jobs that were unfilled. Neighborhood centers in our operation, one of the things that we completely revamped in the 90s was child care, because as a result of welfare reform, most of the families that we had served in the past were moving into the workforce, and so as a result needed child care. In 1995, when I started at the neighborhood centers, we had 12 slots of cooperative child care, which meant that family would come in and work in the child care program, in return get an equivalent amount in hours in return to do respite kinds of things, go out and shop or whatever they could drop their child off. By 1997, after welfare reform, by the end of 1997, we had 120 slots of child care. So we went from 12 to 120 in about 18 months, and directly as a result of this emerging need in the neighborhood. Meanwhile, at this time, Governor Vilsack had put together kind of a group of legislators and key stakeholders in the state to develop a plan they referred to as the Iowa 2010 plan. And at that time, there was really the economy was hot. There was really a focus on recruiting people to move to Iowa. Governor Vilsack opened welcome centers in a few cities around Iowa, really to be the sort of the port for folks moving into Iowa. In the document that was produced by this blue ribbon panel, they were very focused on a diverse workforce, stopping the brain drain, making sure that we could entice young folks to stay in Iowa, improving wages, affordable and accessible early education and child care. These were all very grand ideas that came out of the Iowa 2010 proposal. But today we see, and I recall having conversations with legislators and folks in Congress about, these commitments are great both on the welfare reform side, but also on the Iowa side relative to the 2010 goals and plan, but that we needed to make commitments. For instance, the welcome centers. We need it if we're going to commit to welcome centers, then we should maintain those welcome centers even when the economy goes a little south on us. Today, the unemployment's high. We see, a lot of budget austerity measures at the state level. Child care assistance over the last 3 or 4 years has become really very bureaucratic and kind of inconsistent in payment. And somewhat stingy in how they dole out benefits. And so as a result, you see families who are sort of yo-yoing in and out of child care assistance eligibility. Very hard to hold a job when you don't have secure child care. We're also closing doors on newcomers, both at a state level and locally. I think locally, I think back, often people, if you're familiar with kind of some of the conversations in Iowa City, there's a lot of discussion about the folks from Chicago moving to Iowa City. And that being a very negative thing. It's kind of, there's a lot of coded word messages in some of the discussions about that. But the fact of the matter is there was a period of time when we were really encouraging people to move here. And now we are in a time when there are probably fewer jobs available, and we are less welcoming to those newcomers. Also, discouraging success. Colin talked a little bit about the cliff, in terms of benefits and income. Child care being an important factor here. You see folks who begin to, we're trying to move people out of welfare and into a working environment. You start to get ahead. You start to make a little bit of money, and suddenly you realize you're making too much money, and your child care assistance goes away. Well, it's really difficult for somebody to justify making 10 cents an hour more if in fact they're going to lose their child care as a result of that increased wage. So while that sounds sort of hypothetical, I see that happening all the time with people. That's not just sort of an academic thing. It really does happen. And I recently had a family or a gentleman that was at the centers who came in probably 6 months ago, and he has a 2-year-old who has a feeding tube. It said his child is kind of delayed and had some issues with her ability to chew and swallow food, so she had a feeding tube. And this gentleman had gotten his custody of his daughter because his wife had lost custody. They were split, and she had lost custody, and the child was in foster care. And so the wheels were in motion, and she was about to lose custody. He was about to gain custody. He came into the centers several weeks in advance before he received custody, trying to secure child care. He did, in fact, get child care at the center, so we've started him in child care. They were in for a few weeks, and he started to need to go do doctor's visits with his child. So he was taking time off work, and in order to be eligible for child care, you have to work at least 28 hours a week. And so there were a couple of weeks where because he was tending to his child's health care needs, his hours dipped below 28. And so as a result, he lost his child care. So now he lost his job because he didn't have child care. He had to stay home with his child. His work fired him. So now he's unemployed, sitting at home with his child. So I guess my question is, how does that really help him move off welfare? And the other point is that really we need to, and I think Colin addressed this a little bit, we really need to smooth out and provide more consistency in the realm of child care assistance. The other thing is I've seen in recent years is we've developed programming and supports that are really designed more for kind of an acute need versus a chronic need. And occasionally we see folks who are really kind of having more serious issues, whether it's substance abuse or mental health issues or so forth, that really are not going to be a good candidate for a normal track. And so most of the programming that we see, both in the form of grants and supports for welfare recipients or folks moving off of welfare, are designed for folks who are really more of the acute rather than chronic. And so while we can put a lot of energy into those folks, if you've got chronic mental illness and have maybe a substance abuse problem, they're not going to be adequate to address the needs of those folks. So where really is the pathway to self-sufficiency? I think what we look at is really these two perspectives in terms of how we view poverty and how we look at poverty policy. And I think there's sort of a middle area too. And if you look at kind of where the Clinton administration sort of came in between these two, but I think that there's a sense that poor people are really a victim of their circumstance, or are they responsible for their circumstance? And I think that's really kind of where it breaks down. Anyway, that's all I have. Thank you.